Hello, I'm Steve Scott. Welcome to Nightwatch. More than a century after two separate serial killers stalked London's foggy Victorian streets, mystery still surrounds their real identities. First, there was Jack the Ripper, responsible for a string of unsolved murders. Then, the Lambeth poisoner, another sadist who preyed on prostitutes. But who were they? And could they have been one and the same man? It remains the most famous chapter in Victorian criminal history, a series of murders in London's poor Whitechapel district, where the local prostitutes proved easy prey to a killer dubbed Jack the Ripper. The girls were snatched from the streets where they worked, their throats cut and their bodies left horribly mutilated. No one was ever brought to justice, which is why, 120 years later, we're still asking the question, who was Jack the Ripper?
In the early hours of Friday, the 31st of August, 1888, Mary Ann Nichols was found slaughtered in the streets of Whitechapel. She was the first of 5 prostitutes to die at the hands of the man that would become the world's most notorious serial killer. The killer was never caught, and the mystery has remained unsolved for over a century. Dozens of suspects have been identified over the years, but 4 men, each with their own motive and related evidence, have repeatedly been named as the killer. They are Aaron Kosminski, identified at the scenes of the crimes by an eyewitness. James Maybrick, a damning personal journal has been discovered. Sir William Gull, believed to have been part of a royal conspiracy. And artist Walter Sickert, linked to the case through modern DNA testing. 5 murders, 4 suspects. Which one is Jack? Each suspect hid his own deep, dark secret. Years of research have uncovered vital clues and apparent motives, revealing that any one of these 4 men could be Jack the Ripper. Aaron Kosminski was a favorite police suspect at the time of the investigation.
Kosminski is mentioned in 2 sources by name. The memoirs of Sir Robert Anderson, the head of the CID at the time of the crime. The second source is a man called Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson, and then he goes on to give us a rather startling story that Jack the Ripper had in fact been identified by an eyewitness, that the eyewitness had refused to testify.
James Maybrick, whose shocking confessional diaries were discovered in 1992.
I had a call from my agent, Doreen Montgomery in London, who'd had a call from a man in Liverpool who said he'd got the diary of Jack the Ripper. He had it in a brown paper parcel, which we opened, and there was this diary signed, yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
Suspect number 3, Sir William Gull, a suspect in a royal conspiracy uncovered in the 1970s.
Sir William Gull, the physician to Queen Victoria, was he was involved in a Freemasonic conspiracy to silence 5 women who were trying to blackmail the royal family.
In more recent years, modern technology has been used to identify the 4th suspect, artist Walter Sickert.
Patricia Cornwall was able to get hold of the Openshaw letter, and she was able to subject the stamp and the gum on the envelope to DNA testing for mitochondrial DNA, and found that the DNA on the letter was the same sort of mitochondrial DNA as Walter Sickert.
Each suspect appeared to have their own piece of evidence linking them to the murders, but as they attempted to unravel the mystery, researchers set about looking for motives. For the first suspect, the motive was straightforward. Aaron Kosminski was clinically insane.
Kosminski was a sort of a Polish Jew. He believed he was controlled by voices from outer space. And these voices told him that he mustn't eat the food that he was given by friends or relations. He had to eat the food that he found on the streets. So he'd often be seen on his hands and knees sort of crawling around the streets eating what he could find from the gutters.
He's said to have had great hatred of women. But again, we don't know why suspicion ever fell on him.
James Maybrick was a well-respected cotton merchant living in Liverpool. Married to a young American girl, Florence, they appeared to be the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, they lived a double life of addiction, adultery, and murder.
When he was in America, James Maybrick contracted malaria and they treated him with arsenic and he became addicted to it. And at that time, you could go into any chemist and ask for a pick-me-up. And they would mix it there and then with strychnine or arsenic, and you drank it in the shop. And we know for a fact that he went into one shop up to 5 times a day. Apparently it makes you feel like Superman. Apparently it was taken then for the same reason people use cocaine today.
Maybrick's secret drug abuse took its toll, and a year after the last Ripper murder, he died, apparently from arsenic poisoning. However, his story was far from over.
James Maybrick became increasingly ill and finally died in May 1889. Florence, who was clearly being framed, was then accused of his murder, poisoning him by arsenic. She was condemned to death, but she was, in the end, the sentence was commuted and she went to jail for 15 years. It was a miscarriage of justice.
Fueled by drugs, Maybrick could be a cruel and violent man.
He did genuinely love Florrie. I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. He was captivated by her. But under the effect of the drugs, that changed, and he was capable of anything.
He had a mistress from at least 1865.
Florence found out about the mistress, I think in about 87, and Florence started herself a love affair with the then handsome Alfred Brierley, also a cotton merchant.
According to the diary, Maybrick's reaction to his wife's conspicuous infidelity was explosive.
He saw Florrie walking with Alfred Brierley, who was the lover, in Liverpool's Whitechapel.
And he says, I can't kill her because I'll get caught. But I'll always come to the nearest relative first. And so I'll go to the city of whores, London.
The third suspect was identified over 100 years after the killings. For Sir William Gull, murder would have been a far less emotional or calculated affair.
The Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson, was involved in the Jack the Ripper murders. The story was that he made a secret marriage witnessed by Mary Kelly, and this marriage would lead to an abdication crisis. Mary Kelly has told the other 4 prostitutes of this secret, so this great plot is involved to conceal the secret of the marriage, and that involves murdering the 5 prostitutes.
There was strong Republican feeling at the time. If it had been found out that the Duke of Clarence had had an illegitimate child with a Catholic, it could have brought the monarchy down.
If the theory is to be believed, is it possible that Queen Victoria called upon her loyal servants to silence the prostitutes?
I don't imagine Queen Victoria herself was involved in any kind of a plot, but she would have discussed it with various people, and some of these various people were high-ranking Freemasons who organised this plot to kill these 5 women, with the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull, doing the actual job.
More recently, crime writer Patricia Cornwell has spent millions of her own money investigating the theory that artist Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper, driven to murder through a sexual inadequacy.
Patricia Cornwell's theory or suggestion, and it's one that perhaps she made rather more out of than she should have done, and which other people have made more out of than she wishes that they've done, is that Walter Sickert kind of became Jack the Ripper because he'd had this rather horrible operation as a child, a fistula on the penis. And this probably would have necessitated the amputation of the penis. And this in turn somewhat twisted his mind and made him go out and murder people.
But his impotence is questioned.
He was a man who was married 3 times. There is evidence of other affairs. There's even suggestions of an illegitimate child.
One of his best friends actually refers to him as basically having put it about a bit and sort of sired children all over the place. So the evidence would seem to indicate that far from being the sexual cripple, that in fact he did enjoy a full and active, if not overactive, sex life.
With the motive for each man established, researchers began examining the evidence and eliminating the suspects. The net was finally closing in on Jack the Ripper.
After the break, the net continues to close, and we find out whether modern forensic science can help to reveal the Ripper's true identity. That's to come. Welcome back. In 1888, the shadow of Jack the Ripper loomed large in the dark and smoggy streets of London's Whitechapel district. 5 women had been horribly murdered, and it seemed only a matter of time before Jack would kill again. Police tried to link the victims in an effort to find their man, but it was no easy task.
Between August and November 1888, 5 East End prostitutes were murdered at the hands of Jack the Ripper. Each had had their throats cut and were savagely mutilated. The 5 victims were Mary Ann Nichols. Did she die because she knew too much? Silenced by Sir William Gull. Annie Chapman. Was she unlucky enough to meet Walter Sickert in a dark Whitechapel alley? Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who were both apparently seen with Kosminski on the night of their murder. And Mary Kelly, the last and most gruesome of the murders. Did she die at the hands of James Maybrick, furious with jealousy and driven to murder because of his wife's infidelity? Who killed the 5 prostitutes? Kosminski was the only suspect to be named by officers at the time, identified by an eyewitness who had seen Jack the Ripper with one of his victims.
The identification is probably as big a mystery as the identity of Jack the Ripper. We're aware basically of only 2 Jewish witnesses. One is a man called Joseph Lavender, the other one is a man called Israel Schwartz.
Joseph Lavender claims to have seen Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's 4th victim, on the night of her murder. Did he see her with Kosminski?
The eyewitness who claims to have seen Kosminski is sort of actually identifying the man that he sees talking to Catherine Eddowes at the entrance to Mitre Square. But again, when he's actually brought forward for identification, he says that he didn't really have a good look at the suspect.
It is unlikely that Lavender would have been able to positively identify Kosminski, and so attention was drawn to the 2nd witness. Israel Schwartz reported seeing Elizabeth Stride, the Ripper's 3rd victim, with a man in Berner Street.
I would personally think that Schwartz was more likely to have been the witness, primarily because he actually saw a woman being attacked. And it's somewhat unlikely that Elizabeth Stride would have been attacked by different men in the same spot within a quarter of an hour, because it was a quarter of an hour after Schwartz passed by that the body was found. It's arguable that either Schwartz or Lavender actually got a good view of the murderer, or a good view of anybody, really.
Despite reports that an eyewitness had positively identified Kosminski, he was never arrested and the eyewitness was never named. In the 1970s, a story emerged that Jack the Ripper was connected in some way to the royal family. The theory suggested that the victims were silenced after they had devised a blackmail plot that threatened to topple the monarchy.
When they tried to blackmail the royal family decided, right, they'll get rid of these 5 women.
The Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, is supposed to have called upon fellow Freemasons. They're supposed to have provided the royal physician William Gull to have killed the prostitutes.
Gull had been a long-standing loyal servant to the Queen. but there is a question as to whether he was capable of murder.
I don't believe that Sir William Gull was involved with the Jack the Ripper murders. I don't believe that anymore.
This theory has now been used, I think, in about 4 movies, including the most recent one, From Hell, with Johnny Depp. And it really just doesn't hold water at all, for the simple reason that if they had wanted to take 5 prostitutes off the streets of the East End of London at that time, they could have done it very quietly and very silently, and hardly anybody would have noticed, and fewer still would have cared.
The royal conspiracy was discredited. The story had been told by Joseph Sickert, who claimed to be a relation of the world-famous artist Walter Sickert. Joseph Sickert later retracted the conspiracy story, but its telling pushed another suspect into the spotlight. Was Walter Sickert Jack the Ripper?
Sickert's been linked to the Ripper story for a great many years, but had never really been figured or fingered as Jack the Ripper outside of one book by a lady called Jean Overton Fuller.
Jean Overton Fuller suggested that there was a cover-up, but instead of Sir William Gull, it was Walter Sickert who had been engaged to silence the 5 prostitutes.
Her story is unfortunately a very difficult one to assess. What we're dealing with is a story that wasn't told as a whole narrative, but was told piecemeal over a period of time, and has gone through 2 people in the telling.
The Walter Sickert theory was soon overshadowed when in 1992 a diary believed to have been written by James Maybrick was discovered. If found to be authentic, it provided documented evidence to the identity of Jack the Ripper.
The Maybrick diary isn't a theory, it's a fact, it's an artefact. The diary tells the story of the killings of the 5 murder victims in Whitechapel. And it tells the story in every horrific detail, plus all the writer's personal responses and reactions to what he's doing at the time.
A known drug addict, it was believed that Maybrick was driven to murder through jealousy of his wife's affair. The diaries seemed to support this theory, and a major breakthrough came with photographic evidence from the scene of Mary Kelly's murder.
He had some photocopies made through a computer of the original photographs that the police had taken in Mary Kelly's room, photographs of her body.
It's a horrible, horrible photograph of the mutilation and the dissection of the body.
After a while, we became aware that on the wall behind her body was the initials FM.
FM, of course, being Florence Maybrick's initials.
He was killing his wife.
Maybrick was propelled to the top of the suspect list, as details within the journal suggested that whoever had written it had to have been at the scene of the crime. However, unable to date when the ink went on the paper, experts were reliant on evidence within the diary.
We know the diary itself is a Victorian diary, the paper is okay, and we can't tell when the ink went on the paper. But as far as we can tell, it must have been partly because of the internal evidence within the diary before 1987.
There was a list of Catherine Eddowes' belongings that were found strewn around her body, and they were listed in the newspapers. And it was only in the 1980s that the original police list was discovered, and in it listed something that wasn't, well, that was held back by the police when they give the list to the newspapers, and it was a tin box, an empty tin matchbox. In the Maybrick Journal, he says, damn, the tin box was empty. And so the historians were saying, this must be a modern forgery after the 1980s, because it contains information that's only just been found. On the other hand, the scientists were saying, this ink has been on this paper 100 years.
But the diary showed characteristics that suggested it was a modern-day forgery. Before it was discovered, Ripper experts had predicted that any fake would be written in an old journal and have pages missing from the front. Their predictions proved correct.
These sort of statements were made because that's kind of typical of fairly common forgers, so therefore the diary would not look to be that much of a sophisticated creation.
Critics also questioned the handwriting.
The handwriting itself, all the experts have said, isn't the same as James Maybrick's.
One of the early criticisms was that the writing was nothing like James Maybrick's will.
The fact that all the handwriting examiners have said that the handwriting isn't Maybrick's, I think that that does have to carry weight, and we do have to think that the diary is a forgery for that reason.
However, with such conflicting findings, researchers weren't convinced that either Maybrick or Jack the Ripper had written the diary, and some even dismissed it as a fake.
I was accused myself of obviously perpetrating something for financial gain, of telling lies, of hiding information, suppressing reports, you name it, I did it. And I didn't.
The whole diary just seemed so unlikely. It seemed unreasonable to suppose that Jack the Ripper would have kept a diary anyway.
In the 10 years that people have been trying to expose it, there has not been one shred of evidence that makes it a forgery. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to prove it's genuine either, which is half of the puzzle, of course.
The recent emergence of new evidence caught the attention of crime writer Patricia Cornwell, and she set about trying to prove that one of our 4 suspects was actually Jack the Ripper after all.
She was told about Walter Sickert by a senior police officer. It was not quite clear precisely what he said or why he said it, but it was sufficient to fire Patricia Cornwell's interest and curiosity.
A letter signed Jack the Ripper and sent containing a part of a human kidney, apparently from one of the victims, had been with a private collector for over 30 years. It emerged in the public domain and provided Patricia Cornwell with the first and only piece of evidence that could be tested for DNA.
A letter that I had in my possession was a letter addressed to Dr. Openshaw of the London Hospital. Now, I was given this letter many, many years ago. I had it in my possession for the best part of 30 years. And it was at the beginning of last year that I deposited it in the Public Record Office.
The letter has been examined for DNA by people working on behalf of Patricia Cornwell, and that they found DNA that links to personal letters written by Walter Sickert.
It appeared the mystery had been solved. But once again, doubt was cast on how reliable this evidence was.
She was only able to test for what is called mitochondrial DNA. Now, this is a DNA that is inherited through the female side of the family, and it goes back for generations. The DNA on the letter was the same sort of mitochondrial DNA as Walter Sickert, which seemed quite impressive to start off with until you realise that it was also the same DNA as 1% of the population.
It's probably my DNA on it. I had it for about 30 years.
The evidence that once seemed so compelling was all of a sudden less convincing.
Even if she could show that a letter had been written by Sickert and signed by him as Jack the Ripper, that does not make him Jack the Ripper. Lots of people wrote hoax letters.
Unable to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper, the 4th and final suspect can be eliminated. The true identity of the world's most famous serial killer remains unknown. But with such a booming industry surrounding the Ripper murders, it seems certain that further suspects will come to light.
Three years after the Ripper murders stopped, the prostitutes of London were terrorised by another sadistic serial killer. This one used poison, seemingly revelling in the long and agonising death it brought to his victims. Coming up, the tale of the Lambeth poisoner, another true crime story. Welcome back to Nightwatch as we return to the smoggy streets of Victorian London, where Jack the Ripper is quickly passing into legend and the red light district is back to what passes for normality. That is, until a teenage prostitute meets a particularly nasty end.
Victorian London, 1891. 3 years after Jack the Ripper's reign of terror. For the capital's prostitutes, life is beginning to return to normal when there is a chilling occurrence. A working girl, Ellen Donworth, dies on the streets of Lambeth. Is Jack back, or is a new killer preying on the ladies of the night?
London in the 1890s was a teeming, heaving city of gaslight and fogs. The men dressed in tall silk hats, the women in bustles and bows.
But for those who were poor, like Ellen, life was hard. Houses were overcrowded and disease was rife. It would be easy to understand why she turned to a life on the streets.
The economic attraction of prostitution was always going to be great. They could earn 7, 10, 12 times as much a year as they'd previously done as a domestic servant or as a factory worker or whatever.
Many of these unfortunates, as they were known, lived south of the river.
Lambeth was so notorious by the end of the 19th century that Waterloo was jokingly referred to as Hortaloo.
Lambeth's prostitutes plied their trade with the hundreds of music hall goers and commuters who passed through the area.
In the 1890s, there were something like 10 or 12 theatres and music halls packed into Waterloo.
And there was no shortage of clients.
With Waterloo Station just over there, the Cut there, Lower Marsh Street Market behind us, it would have been teeming with people. And in the evening, when the market would have still been open, there would have been crowds and crowds and crowds circulating.
But behind the fun and frolics, there was a darker side to life.
You just have to turn down a side street off of these sort of busy, well-lighted main thoroughfares to go back into the kind of poverty warrens where people like Ellen Donworth would have lived.
Women like Ellen may have been attracted by the money, but they had chosen a dangerous lifestyle.
The life of the average prostitute in Lambeth, or anywhere else for that matter in the 1890s, was generally nasty, brutish and short.
Unwanted pregnancies, backstreet abortions and alcoholism were just some of the risks they faced.
It's not really surprising that huge numbers of prostitutes finally ended up by committing suicide.
With few brothels in London, women carried out their business in their own homes or out on the streets. They were easy prey for unsavory characters.
Any client who picked up any one of these women could potentially have been Jack the Ripper, could certainly potentially be some sort of killer.
In 1891, Ellen Donworth was just 19. She had given up her job labelling bottles and had started work as a prostitute. She lived just off Stamford Street.
This is the actual street where Ellen Donworth lived. We know that she was renting a room off a landlady. There were other people in other rooms. That's all she could have afforded.
On the 13th of October, Ellen received a note from a stranger, a man called Fred. He asked to meet her at the York Hotel on Waterloo Road. She hoped he would become a regular client.
He was dressed in the style of what the Victorians called a nut. That's a K-N-U-T, a rather dashing silk-lined cloak, a gold-top cane, a very tall silk hat.
He was a passably attractive man, so therefore she would have thought she was in the presence of some very grand person and been very impressed.
But Ellen's trust in this man was badly misplaced. This cost her her life. At around 7 that evening, she said goodbye to Fred and left the pub. These were to be some of her last ever steps. Within minutes, she was finding it difficult to walk and was suffering from excruciating pains. She was found by a friend who thought she was drunk, but she was suffering from something much more sinister.
She was put to bed and she was gripped by terrible convulsions. The poor girl took all night to die.
Ellen managed to tell her landlady that she had drunk twice from a bottle of pale liquid. It had been given to her by the man she had gone to meet, the mysterious Fred. She was taken to hospital but died in the street on the way there. A post-mortem revealed that her stomach contained large quantities of strychnine.
If somebody wanted to inflict a very malicious type of death on somebody, they'd think of strychnine, I think. It will cause convulsions within about 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, and they get worse and worse as the blood levels increase. It's a really painful death.
I think it's almost unimaginable, it's so horrible.
Her death shocked the prostitute community of Lambeth.
It was a very local affair. Her body was found round the corner near Waterloo Station. She was brought back here. She was screaming in agony through the night. Obviously, everyone in the street would have known about it. And eventually, of course, everyone in Lambeth knew about it once it hit the papers.
And these women had every cause for concern.
The killer, whoever he was, got some kind of amazing buzz out of it and couldn't wait to do it again.
Fred was seen with another woman just a week later.
Her name was Louisa Harvey, or Lou Harvey. She met this odd man opposite Charing Cross Underground Station.
That night they went to a pub for a drink, and after that walked down to the embankment where this man pressed her to take 2 long white pills which he'd produced from his waistcoat pocket. They were wrapped in tissue paper. When the man was satisfied that Lou Harvey had indeed swallowed the pills and followed them up with the figs, he suddenly, out of the blue, cancelled their plans to go on to the music hall, which was the arrangement, turned on his heel and walked off into the darkness.
What then happened to this young prostitute was a complete mystery.
Louisa Harvey, to all intents and purposes, vanished.
6 months later, there was still no sign of her, but she was not to be Fred's last victim. 2 girls living in Stamford Street, Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell, befell a similar fate.
This area, Stamford Street and Waterloo Road Junction, was known as Misery Junction.
In April 1892, they had a dinner of tinned salmon at their home in Misery Junction with a man they had recently met.
In a room, an upstairs room like this, one of them was found foaming at the mouth, standing at the bedroom door, and her companion lying groaning on the bed.
Both women died agonizing deaths that night, and once again, the cause was strychnine. When asked why they had taken pills from a stranger, one said he was no stranger, he was a doctor.
The public have always had trust for doctors. These girls were prostitutes, so they would have been more compliant and agreeable to keep their clients happy, I think.
After their deaths, an intriguing development took place.
A Dr. Joseph Harper of Barnstaple in Devon received a blackmail letter. It was signed by someone calling himself Murray, who claimed to have proof that Dr. Harper's son, who was a medical student, had poisoned Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell.
Dr. Harper, like any other parent, would have felt absolutely horrified at having his son accused of murder.
Dr. Harper's son, Walter, did work in Lambeth. So could he have been the culprit?
Well, he must have found himself in a horrible predicament because he had been accused of murder, and therefore he was expected to put up some kind of defence against the accusation.
He clearly would have had access as a young medical intern to the strychnine, which was the method of poisoning Shrivell and Marsh. But in fact, there was really no evidence, apart from the allegation made boldly in the letter, to suggest that Dr. Harper Jr. had in fact had any involvement with the women or had any responsibility for their death.
The blackmailer accused Walter Harper of poisoning the 2 women, but the letter was sent before their post-mortems. So who had written these letters?
The blackmailer had to be someone who had inside knowledge.
Murray, whoever he was, the writer of the letter to Dr. Harper, could even have been the killer.
A number of blackmailing letters were sent in connection with the murders. The most puzzling mentioned another young prostitute, Matilda Clover.
They knew she was a prostitute, they knew she was dead, but they thought that she died of drink. They had not suspected murder. Her death had gone unreported in the papers. So how did this mysterious blackmailing letter writer know that she'd been killed and furthermore had been poisoned?
The police thought that it was just the work of a lunatic, and therefore they discounted that letter completely when they received it.
With 3 girls dead and the murderer still prowling the streets of London, the police were under pressure to catch the killer. But they had a number of questions still to answer. Were the poisoner and blackmailer one and the same? Had Matilda Clover really died of alcoholism? And who and where was Lou Harvey?
The detectives of the day would have clamped a bowler hat over their ears and put on a heavy overcoat and stomped off, making door-to-door inquiries.
Using these methods, there was a breakthrough. The police found a major suspect. A tall, dark man called William Slater was not only found in possession of strychnine, but had been seen in Ellen's company around the time of her death. The police thought they had found the killer.
In fact, it was a dead end, and Slater was, in fact, charged with an entirely unrelated murder.
On the 16th of April, a local newspaper reported that a man called Clifton had been seen with the Stamford Street girls on the night of their deaths. The police frantically searched for more evidence, but luck was against them.
There was nothing else to actually link him with their death, apart from that fact that he had been with them.
The hunt for the killer had caught the public's imagination. People all over London tried to crack the case themselves. John Haynes, a former detective, was desperate to get a job with Scotland Yard. He teamed up with Thomas Neal, a doctor who lived in Lambeth. Between them, they had a wealth of information, and it was their discussions that would eventually lead to a major breakthrough.
They became quite pally and went to the pubs together and chatted up the case. Obviously, Haynes had a professional interest in, and this man Neal said he was a doctor. So therefore, he obviously shared interest in this poisoning matter.
But then Neal started divulging information that was just too good to be true. He knew more about the murders than Haynes, and far more than Scotland Yard.
Neal talked a lot to Haynes about the Lambeth poisonings as they'd now become known in the press, and even went to the extent of giving Haynes a guided tour of some of the murder sites. That seemed an extraordinary thing to do to Haynes, who became increasingly suspicious by the day.
Neal told Haynes that he knew the 3 women, Lou Harvey, Matilda Clover, Ellen Donworth, who had been murdered the previous autumn. At that time, it was not known that Matilda Clover had been poisoned. And as far as Lou Harvey was concerned, there was absolutely no evidence at all that she was dead.
Well, this aroused Haynes' suspicion, being a detective or an ex-detective, because he wondered how Neal knew about these matters.
At first, Haynes wasn't sure about Neal. Was he a fantasist, or was he harboring a sinister secret?
The answer to that in a moment, plus an extraordinary confession on the gallows. Welcome back. Police were getting nowhere in the hunt for the Lambeth poisoner, a sadist who gave fatal pills and potions to prostitutes. Ex-detective John Haynes, desperate for a job with Scotland Yard, thought he would try to crack the case himself. He teamed up with local doctor Thomas Neal to compare notes, but the good doctor seemed to know more than he ought to.
As time went on, Haynes did become more concerned that what he was being given was not false information, but information with at least an essential factual basis to it.
Although slightly perturbed, Haynes saw a way of furthering his career. He went to Scotland Yard. They were very interested in what he told them.
What the authorities did know was that the blackmailer, whoever he was, had mentioned these women by name in the course of his extortionist letters. So the thought at this stage was perhaps that we're on to the trail not necessarily of the murderer, but at least on the trail of the blackmailer.
In late April, house-to-house inquiries in Matilda Clover's neighbourhood proved crucial to the investigation.
They found someone living with her who described Matilda Clover's last symptoms, and they certainly matched up in terms of what they knew about the deaths of Ellen Donworth, Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivell.
On the basis of this information, the police investigation picked up pace. It seemed they had another murder on their hands. Matilda Clover's body was exhumed on the 6th of May, 1892. 14 corpses had to be taken out of the pauper's grave before her body could be removed, and interestingly, it was remarkably well preserved.
The pathologist who examined Matilda Clover's body was very thorough. It took him 3 weeks, and in that time he was grinding up pieces of tissue until he had a paste, and then he could apply tests to the liquid that he produced. Clearly he found most of the poison in her stomach contents. After tasting it to find that it was bitter, he administered some of it to a frog, and it had typical strychnine convulsions and died.
I think the exhumation was a crucial part of the police investigation, because once they exhumed the body and established that Matilda Clover had died through strychnine poisoning, then certain parts of the jigsaw began to fall into place.
The blackmailer knew about Matilda's poisoning, and so did Thomas Neal. So could they be one and the same? The police interviewed Dr. Harper and found that the blackmail letter he had received matched Neal's handwriting. This was the hard evidence they'd been looking for, and Neal was arrested for blackmail on the 3rd of June. Then, interesting news came from abroad.
The authorities got word from Canada as to the real identity of the man that they knew as Thomas Neal. In fact, he was Thomas Neal Cream. He'd decapitated his name, if that's the right expression, shortened it certainly to Thomas Neal.
With his identity revealed, the true nature of Cream's character became apparent. Across the Atlantic, he was known as an abortionist, blackmailer, and convicted murderer. With this new information, the police were sure Cream was involved in the 4 murders and the strange disappearance of Lou Harvey. Time was against them, but more interviews with Matilda's friends proved crucial to the investigation.
Eyewitnesses soon thereafter came forward and identified Dr. Neal as a person they had seen with Matilda Clover back in October '92, shortly before her death.
Matilda Clover's inquest took place in court on the 22nd of June, and Cream was now on trial for murder.
The procedure was slightly different in 1892 in that it was open to a jury in those days not only to find the cause of death, but to actually name the person who had, in fact, unlawfully caused that death.
Things were already looking bad for Cream, but they were about to get worse in what was one of the most extraordinary incidents in legal history.
There was a sensational development when a surprise witness came forward, none other than Louisa Harvey, or Lou Harvey, who'd read her own name in the newspaper in the course of the evidence.
And there she was in the witness box, giving a detailed account implicating him in the clearest possible way in an attempt to murder her.
Lou Harvey's real name was Louisa Harris. She had been suspicious of this man, Fred, and had concealed her true identity. She described how she'd pretended to take pills from the man in the courtroom, but had thrown them on the ground at the last minute. This single act had surely saved her life.
Well, as you can imagine, he was completely stunned.
He almost couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been sitting quietly, but then looked at this woman, took his glasses off, literally rubbed his eyes, as if to say, I just cannot believe what I'm seeing here.
It was quite obvious at that point, if anybody had been in the court, that guilt was written all over his face, because he knew that she was alive when he thought she was dead.
On the 13th of July, the jury found that Matilda Clover had died of strychnine poisoning and that the strychnine had been administered by Cream with the intent to murder. As well as the blackmail letters, Cream was eventually charged with the murders of Clover, Donworth, Marsh and Shrivell, and the attempted murder of Lou Harvey.
I think it had a particular dramatic tension because the defendant was, on the face of it, a respectable professional man, and the victims were prostitutes who in those days were considered as utterly degenerate. But when it became apparent that the case against him was overwhelming, I think public opinion swung totally against him. And in a way, the fact that he was a middle-class professional compounded in people's minds the evil of what he'd done and the evil of who he was.
The trial took place at the Old Bailey in October 1892, and the jury took just 10 minutes to find Cream guilty.
In Victorian times, I think the juries were out for very much shorter times than they are in most criminal trials today, but even by their standards, to return verdicts of guilty on all of those counts within 10 minutes must have been close to a record, particularly as the jury, of course, knew that the inevitable consequence.
Cream was hanged on the 15th of November 1892, but incredibly, he could have escaped prosecution altogether.
You do have this extraordinary situation in which he really convicted himself.
Unfortunately, he committed blunder after blunder and was an absolute egomaniac who thought that everything he did was right and he couldn't fail and had enormous self-confidence and had a lust for murder.
But Cream had one last secret.
His last words were, "I am Jack thee." And then he went to his maker.
So was he Jack the Ripper?
Most people believe that he was in jail in 1888 during the Ripper murders. But I have reason to believe that he was not in jail and that he bribed his way out.
I think it's a great stretch of the imagination to imagine that someone like Cream could have organised things in such a way.
If one accepts that his last words before the noose tightened were, "I'm Jack the," it's always open to speculation that what he intended to say was, "I'm Jack the lad," and not Jack the Ripper.
But Cream is more than just a Ripper suspect. He has his own place in history as one of London's most prolific serial killers.
Cream was convicted and hung and has been forgotten. The Ripper was never found and has never been forgotten.
And that's it from this episode of Nightwatch. I'm Steve Scott. Join me next time.